Hey everyone, this is Marc Sabatella from Mastering MuseScore, and welcome to the MuseScore Café. And apologize for the late start. I'm having my usual struggles with the audio system here, but that's okay because today we're not talking about playback really at all. We're talking about layout. We're talking about spacing. So that's what we'll be talking about today, and so I won't worry about the fact that sounds a little funny here. Let me just check this again. Yeah, it's doing that thing where everything's like a quarter step too high, and it's just the way it is. Oh, oh, wait a minute. Actually, there's more going on than just that. So, so yeah, sometimes it just takes me a minute to figure things out, and it's just weird. Audio output to headphone, microphone there, and let me just make sure. So the question is, do you hear me okay? You all hear me okay, right? I'm probably a little, my voice might be a little higher pitched than it's supposed to be. And maybe that helped, and maybe it didn't. But in any case, if you can hear me and see my screen, then I'm okay. So layout referring to page breaks. Yeah, referring to breaks, but not just breaks, but where, yeah, how MuseScore decides how much space to put into things. So yeah, and my voice is higher pitched than normal, and oh, that's interesting that it worked briefly. That is very interesting. Yeah. All right. Whatever. You can still hear me, right? So that's what matters. So I'm not going to worry about having chipmunk voice, and we're just going to get on with things. So let me show you what we're going to be doing here. What we're going to do, and actually, I'm going to constantly worry about this. Why is this not working? Why is this funny? Let me try putting output again here, and then output again here, and then input again here, and then input again here. This is where it's supposed to be. White cord is plugged in. That's how it's all supposed to work. Okay, what I'm going to do is create a score, and I'm going to put a grand staff on it, and I'm just going to start talking about things, and then you'll get a sense of it. So for people who are, technically inclined and wondering what about is going on, there's two different standards for digital audio as far as when you sample. I don't know if you know anything about digital audio, it converts sound into numbers, right? And the numbers either happen 44,000 times a second or 48,000 times a second. If one device is expecting 44.1 thousand per second, and another device is expecting 48, they're going to be a little out of sync with each other, and one of them's going to think the sound is higher pitched, and the other one's going to think the sound is lower pitched than it actually is. So that's what's happening here between my computer, my mixer. They are out of sync with each other, and it's just hard to. It's just life. So that's what I get for going away and coming back. Is when I come back, things are not the way they were before, and that's just the way it is. So let's talk about the spacing, all right? So what happens here, I'm going to talk about horizontal spacing and vertical spacing as separate things, but they're really largely the same. I'm going to listen to myself in the other headphones just so I can make sure that I'm understanding myself. So if I keep talking and I do this, then, hey, my voice is normal. My voice is normal. At least it is in there. So that much seems normal. The playback might not be, but my voice seems more normal again. Okay, so MuseScore, yeah, so that's exactly what it is. It's that exact that exact thing, and that happens to pitch also. And then the system kind of stutters as it tries to catch up to itself, if that makes sense. And so there will be this little stuttering and a pitch raise. But the stuttering is more obvious listening to music than voice. It does a better job of fixing it with voice. Okay, so the basic idea with how MuseScore lays things out horizontally and then vertically is it figures out how much room something needs. So I'll talk about it horizontally first. Note by note, it figures out how much room each note needs. And then and then the next note, and then the next note, and then the next note, and then it figures out based on that how much room each measure needs. And then the next measure, and then the next measure, and then the next measure. And as soon as it comes to a place where it's like, oh, this measure isn't going to fit, it wraps it around. So it's very much like how a text editor deals with text. So if I start entering some notes here, and I'm going to enter some notes, and I'm going to do this in a fairly deliberate manner. I'm going to enter a whole note in this measure. Yeah, and I can hear the sound is all weird on my computer, but that's okay because I'm just going to turn that totally off because it doesn't matter. Then a couple half notes, then a couple quarter notes, then maybe some eighth notes, and then maybe a measure that has a half note and a quarter note and an eighth note and maybe even some 16th notes. All right, so you can see what's happening, that as I entered stuff, let me undo some of that. As I'm doing this, it's like, notice how many measures are on this system. Like the next system starts with measure 10. As soon as I started entering more eighth notes onto that system, it's like, oop, I can't fit as much on anymore. Yeah, and that's true. I turned off the playback because it's all messed up. My voice is okay, the playback is messed up, so I've just turned off the playback. So that's what I've done to avoid driving myself and everyone else crazy. That just seems to be the way that I'm going to do this today. And I'll do all the investigation that I need so that everything's okay by tomorrow. But yeah, I'm still getting everything back in order from my trip, basically. All right, so as I was entering those eighth notes, you'll notice like right now there's 4 empty measures. And as I keep entering eighth notes, there's 4 measures here. And as I'm entering more eighth notes, they're needing more space. It's making this measure wider, and then it pushed another measure down, right? So it's always figuring out how much room there is and then wrapping things around accordingly. What I'm going to do is just keep entering notes now, and then I'm going to enter what I did before. At a half note, a quarter note, an eighth note, and a couple 16ths, and that doesn't fit anymore. So now maybe I'll just delete this measure, so that we can see that and see if I can enter some quarter notes into this measure again. All right, that all fit. So let's talk about what's going on here. If you look at this, what you're going to see is that the quarter notes in every measure are going to be the same distance. This is one of the huge, enormous improvements in MuseScore 4 compared to MuseScore 3. To me, it's much more significant than any playback improvements. It's the fact that the amount of space now between these quarter notes in measure 3 is exactly the same as the amount of space between, the amount of space a quarter note needs in measure 3 is exactly the same as the amount of space a quarter note needs in measure 4 or in measure 5. So quarter notes are going to have the same amount of space. Same with eighth notes. The eighth note in this measure here, followed by a couple 16ths, is receiving the exact same amount of space as these eighth notes in the previous measure, even though the content of the measure is different. Now, if you're writing a glissando, if you're writing like 30-second notes, I'll talk a little bit more about how the actual algorithm works. Both because A, it's kind of fascinating, and B, it's good to know how the algorithm works so that you know how to override things. But what's basically the case is that MuseScore bases everything on the 16th note. This isn't exactly true, but we're going to treat it as if it is true. That there is a setting in MuseScore that determines this here, how much space MuseScore is going to require for 16th notes. And that is if I go to Format, Style, and then Measure. Where's Measure? Right here. This distance right here where it says minimum note distance, that sets the minimum distance between 16th notes. So this is saying that it's going to require 16th notes to be at least half of a staff space apart. 30-second notes are basically going to get that same amount of space as a minimum, as will 64th notes, etc. In practice, it's not going to work out that way for other reasons I'm going to talk about. But The minimum amount of space that MuseScore is going to require here is half a staff space by default, and that's going to basically apply to your 16th notes and smaller note values. Now, what happens next is the amount of space that MuseScore allocates for 16th notes. You might think that an eighth note should get twice as much space as a 16th because it lasts twice as long, and a quarter note should maybe get twice as much space as an eighth because it lasts twice as long, and a half note should get twice as much space as a quarter note because it lasts twice as long. You might think that, but it doesn't work that way, because if you did that, there would be more space than necessary. That is the best way I can describe. It is occasionally done in educational materials where you'll actually give a half note twice as much space as a quarter, and a quarter twice as much as as an eighth, etc. Occasionally you'll see it in educational materials. Occasionally you'll see it in percussion music where there's multiple things going on and it's very complex. MuseScore allows you to do that. Let me show you what it's going to look like. If I go back to Format, Style, Measure, and we're going to be using this dialog, well, not a lot, but some. This here spacing ratio, this is what tells you how much more space a half note needs than a quarter note. So these two settings that I've talked about, the minimum note distance and the spacing ratio, these are going to be your friends. These will be your friends. So Ariana, you're asking about importing old MuseScore files. Old MuseScore files used a different spacing algorithm that was frankly not as good, nowhere near as good. And as a result of that, the original spacing settings don't apply in MuseScore 4. So they will kind of get converted over to the new settings. The minimum note distance does exist in previous versions. It was interpreted a bit differently. But so if you're importing an old MuseScore file in which you would customize the minimum note distance, it may or may not try to honor that in some way. But this spacing ratio I'm talking about now, that didn't exist in previous versions of MuseScore. Now, if you import one, it's just going to get the default spacing ratio. And same if you import a music XML or MIDI file, you're going to get the default settings here. And these default settings are very good. They lead to very professional results. If you want to see what it looks like for a half note to take twice as much space as a quarter note, I'm going to make the spacing ratio 2. So you didn't know this was going to be a math lesson, but so it is. Now, the half notes literally are taking twice as much space as the quarter notes. Well, look what that did to measure 5 here. Well, first of all, it made everything wider, right? Because everything's requiring more space. But take a look at what measure 5 looks like with that spacing ratio. There is a lot of space after that half note. We're not used to seeing that because normally that's not how things are done. Normally, we don't do that. We don't give a half note twice as much space because it ends up with a lot of kind of wasted space in the score. And usually we're kind of at a premium, right? We're trying to save space, fit more music onto the page within reason. So this particular layout is not how normally things would be done. But Michael, you might be very interested in this if you haven't seen me demonstrate this before. Look at what's going on here. Actually, if I enter a 16th note, that's going to mess this up. Let me enter some eighth notes. Seriously? Well, I'm going to enter a couple half notes then. I wanted to keep the 4 measures on this line. Look at what's going on here now. That's it. This makes it look like the old real book. This is what people did when they were doing things by hand if they didn't know better. I mean, back, 500 years ago, people did things by hand, but they worked out these spacing ratios. They did the math and figured out how to space these things. And so if you look at actual published music, maybe not 500 years ago, I don't know what rules they were using, but say 100 years ago, if you look at published editions of Beethoven and Bach and so forth, they are doing what MuseScore does now. They're kind of compressing this so that a half note doesn't take twice as much as a quarter doesn't take twice as much as an eighth. However, and that gives you measures that are a different width, which is considered a good thing for readability usually. But if you're dealing with music that has chord symbols, like I have a C on this measure, and then maybe in the next measure, maybe this measure has, well, let me just go 2 beats at a time. C, G, C, G, C, G, C, G. Ah, that doesn't quite fit anymore. Okay, so what I'm gonna do, as I added these things, it didn't quite fit. And that's because of those settings there, the spacing ratio and the minimum note distance. What I'm gonna do is I'm actually just gonna reduce the overall, no, I'm gonna reduce the overall size of my score in Format Page Settings, just so I have a little more wiggle room here. Did that do it? That did it. Okay. So that's the overall size of the music. So what's going on now is, even though we've got a half note here, we've got a quarter and an eighth and some sixteenths there, if you're looking at the chord symbols remain equal distance. That's actually very useful if you're reading chord symbols. If you're a pianist or a bass player or a guitar player looking at a lead sheet, you're mostly looking at the chord symbols a lot of the time rather than the melody. So you kind of want the chord symbol spacing to be even. You don't want a measure that's got a lot of eighth notes to need more space than a measure that just has a whole note. We want this measure here with the C and the G to be as wide as these other measures here. So, and that is in fact the case. If I change that spacing ratio back to the default, under measure, change that spacing ratio back to default by hitting the reset button, you'll see now that, and let me just put in some breaks here. I'm going to select this measure, put in a break, select this measure, put in a break. So I still have 4 measures on this line. But you can now see the first measure is a lot wider than that last measure. So, the first measure is a lot wider than the last measure. So, Ariana, what I would say is, if you know what you're doing handwriting the music, then no. People who know what they're doing handwriting music would do this. They would use that same mathematical ratio, the 1.5, anywhere between 1.4 and 1.5-ish is a typical ratio. For people who really want to geek out on the math, the square root of 2, 1.41, blah, 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 is a great ratio, because it means that a half note won't get twice as much as a quarter note, but will get twice as much as an eighth note. And that there's something that's sort of satisfying to the mathematical geek about that idea, that there still is a doubling, but it takes 2 steps. Like from eighth note to quarter note doesn't double the space, but from eighth note to half note doubles the space. So people who knew what they were doing with engraving knew to do that kind of thing, and you would get these unequal measure widths, which is correct. We don't need a whole note to take as much space as these other measures that have like eighth notes in them normally. But if you're doing jazz, it's actually quite useful. So if I'm doing jazz, or really any style in which there's chord symbols involved, it's actually quite useful to turn that spacing ratio up to 2, or at least closer to 2. And then we're going to get measures that are essentially always the same width. And that's going to make our chord symbol space better. So the people who did the old real book, sort of a really popular fake book, they didn't, well, I don't know what they knew about music engraving, but probably they didn't know how those mathematical ratios were supposed to work out. They probably just took the page, divided it into 4 equal parts, because it's easier than doing math. You take the page and you draw bar lines in, right? You draw a bar line in at the midpoint and then cut each one of those in half. That's also why they did things like leave out the clef, because it made it that much easier to figure out where the midpoint is. Terrible decision in almost every other respect, but it did make their job simpler. And same with like leaving out key signatures. So a lot of jazz fake books would leave out clefs, leave out key signatures, and just divide the system up into 4 equal lines, and then put in the notes, and then fill in the chord symbols. So yes, and you can certainly put in the handwritten font for MuseScore independently of the spacing. But if you use a handwritten font and don't use this higher spacing ratio, that's not going to give you the equal-sized measures. So having equal-sized measures is a blessing and a curse, but it's kind of a blessing if you're doing lead sheets. It is generally considered okay to have equal measure widths. It's usually a bad idea because it actually makes it easier to get lost in the page, because now every system kind of looks the same. So most professional editors will go out of their way to make sure the measures are not the same, like the bar lines don't line up from one system to the next. That's considered the more professional thing to do. It aids people reading. But from the perspective of doing this jazz kind of thing where you're reading chord symbols, or pop or any other style where you're reading chord symbols, we kind of want measures to be closer to equal. I find it's still a little awkward to literally set the spacing ratio to 2. So if I'm doing lead sheets, sometimes I'll play with it depending on the specific rhythms or the specific chords. But I might like a value of, say, 1.8 in here, which will give you closer to equal widths, but notice the whole note measure is still a little narrower than the eighth note measure, and yet the chord symbols still seem close to the same spacing. I will be fudging things like that some. So yeah, the double bar line at the end of every system definitely helps delineate systems. I think that's a good idea anyhow. So independently of the widths of the measure, putting double bars at the end of phrases is really good. Anything that helps sight reading, I consider to be good. Anything that helps you negotiate the form. Because if you think about a lead sheet also, we're recycling that thing over and over again. We want to know when we're at the bridge. And we want to know where that bridge is on the page. So things like double bars are really useful. But yeah, the fact that we're making sight reading, we are making some things a little worse by making the measures equal width. The double bars help make up for that a little bit. So yeah, my point here isn't to get totally lost in the math of this, but now that I've showed you a little bit of how this works, let's take a step back now and talk about how we're going to do things to change other than that. So I showed you that, how we can make spacing more equal. But now let's go back to my original thing and say, and we get rid of these system breaks. Let's say I want to get these half notes onto that previous system. Well, I talked about this in the tip of the week in the newsletter. But so what's happening here is MuseScore has figured out the width, the minimum width of everything here. But then, and I wish I could show this to you. There's sort of an option. If I built this myself, if I compiled MuseScore for myself, I'd be able to show you how this works. But this, if you think about like a word processor, it figures out how many words are going to fit on that line. But if you look like here at the comments, notice like the word muse jazz didn't fit after the word the in Ariana's comment. So muse jazz got wrapped around. And as a result, the right margin is ragged. Well, if you do much with word processors, there's an option that says right justify the text, and then it makes the right margins all this, it stretches every line out. It first figures out how much fits, and then it stretches everything to reach the right margin, right? A word processor would do that if you enable justification. And most published books, published newspaper articles, etc., will do that. They will right justify things because it's perceived to look nicer. It's a subjective decision there. Well, in music, it's invariably true. We always right justify these things, right? Oh, Marla, your other question. I would like you to explain in more detail what you mean by adjusting only one note and not spacing all the measures. But for instance, this measure right here, the spacing is correct. If you deliberately want to create incorrect spacing by moving a note, you can go to the properties here and then go to where it says appearance, and then under the offset, we can increase the offset, and that moves that note over. So now it has too much space before it and too little space after it. So if your goal is you're creating an educational workspace and you want to show the wrong answer, you can use that. There's also a few really unusual, but they do exist, situations where you might need to adjust the space of a note to avoid some other problem or something. But you'd better be very careful about doing it because it really messes up the perception of the rhythm to do this. So adding brackets with fingering is all well and good, but do not mess with the spacing of the notes to accommodate anything else. That is almost always a mistake. It's almost always a mistake to adjust notes to accommodate other things, move other things to accommodate the notes. Almost always, that's the better choice. Now, if you have a specific example where you think it might have made sense to move a note, feel free to post a picture of it and we can talk about it in a little more detail. But yeah, you can use the offset field under properties to move notes individually. You can also change the leading space. Like say I wanted to add a little more space between this quarter note and that eighth note. If I just use the offset, it's going to move that eighth note over and it's going to open up space before and close up the space after. Well, maybe that's not what you want. Maybe for some reason you want to add some space in front of that note only. You can do that with the leading adjustment here. If I adjust that upwards, you'll see the note starts moving further away, but it didn't reduce the space afterwards. So it only adds space before the note. So that's a thing also. But MuseScore will generally, if you put some marking in front of that note, it will usually allocate extra space as needed for it, right? If I add some sort of like, if I add an accidental, say, to this C here, making it a C sharp, it added a little extra space to accommodate that. That sharp sign is not going to run into that C. MuseScore is pretty good about automatically adding space. There's some specific cases where it might not, but in general it does. So when I was talking about the justification, this system here is full. It's like justified all the way to the edge. But notice there's like a margin, right? An indentation in the first system. This is another thing borrowed from text. We usually do that at the beginning of every paragraph in published writing. We'll have an indent on the first line of the paragraph. In music, we do that for the first line of every movement. So that's a style setting, though. I can go to Format, Style, and turn off that indentation. Watch what happens if I do that now. So here's the spacing as it is. If I turn off the indentation, the right margin stayed exactly where it was. Let me turn it back on again, right? This bar line stayed right where it was. Look at the space between those 16th notes there. When I turn off, as I'm changing the indentation, oh, it was actually able to fit an extra measure. So let me put in a break right here so I don't have that changing things. I'm going to put in a break here to force the system to end here. And now I'm going to go back to that dialog and now watch what happens as I toggle the indentation. You can see everything is stretching out, right? That's that justification going on. So when I had the indentation on, then there was a certain amount of space between the eighth notes and between the 16th notes. When I turn the indentation off, now there's a little more room to work with, but not enough to fit another measure. Or actually, there was enough to fit another measure, but I put in a system break here to prevent the next measure from sliding up there. Because I wanted to make the point that MuseScore is stretching everything to make that room. So if I, now that I've disabled the indentation, well, now I've re-enabled it because I just hit escape. If I remove this break, this measure doesn't quite fit on that line. But if we eyeball this, we might say, I kind of feel like if I compressed these measures a little more, I could make them fit. So the way you do that is you select all of the measures, and I can't emphasize that enough. You want to select all the measures that you want to be on a single system. Okay, yeah, and I will check Facebook again, Michael. I did see your comments, and I've been engaging a little bit with them, but I'm sure there's been some stuff I've missed this morning. So see you later. Okay, so I want to get this measure onto that system, and I kind of feel like it's probably possible that MuseScore has probably stretched things out here some, and that there really is room for another measure. I don't know that for a fact. So what I want to do is tell MuseScore to take these measures and don't stretch them, because MuseScore by default, and this is what I wish I could show you, those measures might not, I'm putting my hands up to the screen like you can see it, but these measures, if it wasn't stretching it out to reach the margin, to do that justification thing, that bar line might have ended early, soon enough before the actual right margin that maybe this measure could have fit. We won't know until we try. So what I'm going to do is tell MuseScore. So MuseScore normally takes everything like the minimum amount of space for every measure, determines another measure doesn't fit, and then once it decides, okay, this is as much as I can fit, then it stretches it out. Well, I want to tell it, don't stretch that. So I want to sort of reduce that amount of stretch, that amount that it was going to stretch out to fill the margin. I'm going to back that stretch off a little bit. So the command to back off that stretching is going to be the left curly brace. Or if you don't like shortcuts, it's format, stretch, decrease, layout stretch. When I do this, it's going to back off that stretch a little bit. And if that backing off of the stretch a little bit is enough to enable that measure to fit on the system, it will do it. So let me select these again, and I'm going to press left curly brace. And sure enough, that was just enough. Reducing that stretch was just enough to allow it to fit one more measure. Well, now I want to get greedy. I wonder if I can get the next measure on there too. But I first want to undo what I just did. I want to reset the stretch on these measures. I'm going to go to Format, Stretch, Reset, Layout Stretch. Because the point is, I want to reduce the stretch of all of these measures consistently so that that first thing I told you about, all the eighth notes having the same amount of space within a system, all the quarter notes having the same amount of space within a system, I don't want to mess that up by stretching some measures more than others. It's usually pretty important, unless you're going for some special effect, to make all the measures stretch at the same rate. So I reset the stretch, and now I've selected two more measures. I've selected all of these measures on the first system plus 2 on the next system. And now I'm going to start decreasing stretch some more. And sure enough, it took 2 clicks, right? After 1 click, it could only fit 1 more measure. It's reducing that stretch by like 10%. But when I reduced stretch by another notch, it was able to fit another measure. Now, probably I can't fit any more because I'm looking at the space between the 16th notes and between those 8th notes and thinking, if I tried to force another measure to fit, I'm probably going to fail. But I'm going to try anyhow. I'm going to go back to Format, Stretch, Reset, and now I'm going to select one more measure. And I'm going to keep trying to, oh, wow, look at that. It did manage to fit one more. It's able to fit quite a lot, actually. So this is because I am decreasing this stretch factor. I'm telling it, those measures, and this is how much room you thought they needed, and then stretch them out. I'm telling it, hey, let that measure take less space than you think it needs. Forcing the measures to be narrower. And so really what I'm doing is I'm defeating that math, that spacing ratio that says an eighth note should take 1.5 times as much space as a 16th note. Well, look at this. That's clearly not happening here. This eighth note is not, in fact, receiving twice as much, or 1.5 times as much space as that 16th note. I have actually kind of overridden that ratio by kind of crushing it. I didn't even think that was supposed to be possible, but I'm looking at it and eyeballing it. It seems like it is. So reducing stretch is a way to compress these measures to fit more of them on a system. What I often do personally is a different approach. So I'm going to reset the stretch again. And what I usually do is I come over here to Format, Style, Measure, and I will reduce both the spacing ratio from 1.5 to 1.4 and the minimum note distance from 0.5 to 0.4, or maybe even less. And now you can see more stuff fits already. And now I can, I'm going to have too much on every system. Too much on a system is easy to deal with. I can just select a measure, hit enter, and it puts in a line break. So I often like to adjust those settings, the spacing ratio and the minimum note distance, turn them down a little bit so that now every system has too much stuff on it. And then I'll go in and add system breaks, and then it'll stretch everything out again. That's that is an approach that I often like to take because I find it easier than selecting, going through one at a time each system and compressing this system and leaving that system alone. Sometimes it's easier to just go in and decide for myself exactly where I want the breaks to be. It depends on, how you like to do things, I guess. So this general idea, I've talked mostly about horizontal spacing. I want to now point out that vertical spacing works essentially the same way. MuseScore is going to figure out how much space things need vertically. It's going to fit as much as it can onto a page, and then it's going to cut off that, wrap it around to the next page, and then it's going to stretch things out to fill the page. So let's take a look at that in action. I'm going to add some more measures here until it spills onto the next page. Okay, actually, let me undo some of that, and let's look at what's going on here. Look at, right now, there are 4 systems on this page, and it is stretching them out to get to the bottom margin. But there was clearly room for more. That's why there's big gaps here, and this is normally correct. Normally, editors will do that. They will add space between systems to make things kind of fill up the page like that. But if I keep adding measures, now I've got 5 systems, and MuseScore has just closed up that space a little bit, right? Let me reduce that a little more. Watch the space. See how much space there was when there were 4 systems? When I add another measure, now there's 5 systems, and it just compressed the space a little bit. And furthermore, if I keep going to the point where now there's 6 systems, well, it just compressed the space for some more. But not only did it compress the space between the systems, it compressed the space within the system as well. So look how much space there is between the 2 staves, the treble and bass clef staff here, and as soon as I add another measure to force another system, it actually compressed that space. So MuseScore is able to both stretch out the space between systems, but also within the systems to try to fit things the way you want, or to fit things optimally. The goal is that you shouldn't have to know the professional editor's rules. You shouldn't have to have read Behind Bars, Elaine Gould's book on how to do things. And actually, I don't even know that she deals with this particular topic. She probably does. But you're not supposed to have to know all the rules for how music notation works exactly in these details. You're supposed to just enter the music and let MuseScore take care of it. So that's why it's constantly adjusting spacing. And you'll often hear me say, someone will say, hey, my staves are too spread apart or too squished together, and they haven't even entered any music yet. Well, then I will say, don't worry about it yet, because until you enter music, you're not going to know. Like until I start entering some, as soon as I start entering some notes here, it's going to not have that many measures on, right? There were, before I started entering those, let's count. There were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 measures there. But now as I start to enter eighth notes here, I'm clearly not having as many measures on here. It keeps pushing measures on to the next line. So now there's only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 measures on it because they're full. So MuseScore is doing all that stuff automatically. So you shouldn't be worrying about the spacing of things until you've entered your music. That's kind of an important comment. And also thinking about the space between staves. You might look at this and say, let me add some more measures here to actually get onto the next page. So you might be looking at this and say, gee, these staves are really close together. This doesn't look good. And yeah, I would be inclined to agree, but we haven't entered any notes onto the bottom staff. If I enter, say, a D here, and then some more Ds, oh, look at that. They didn't quite, but if I start adding notes higher up, it's adding more space as necessary. Or if I have, say, a dynamic marking anywhere here, like if I take this B and go to the palettes and add a dynamic marking, it's going to add space as necessary. So generally speaking, you don't want to look at the music and say, hey, there's not enough room here to enter music. No, as you enter music, it's going to create the room. When you're done entering the music, then it's time to take a step back and see if you, like what you see or not. So I'm going to do another thing here. I'm going to fill the score with notes and then take a look at what's going on. So at this point, MuseScore has done what I've described it doing. It's vertically deciding how many systems can fit on this page, and then it stretches them out to fill the page, and it managed to fit 6 in at, here. Well, the next page only has 2. Well, MuseScore is smart enough not to stretch them out to fill all the way to the bottom of the page, because that would look stupid, right? One system at the top, one at the bottom. So it has an algorithm it uses to figure out, well, I'm going to stretch it out a little bit and not all the way. And generally, that's not bad. The way it does that is okay. It's if I were looking at this, I wouldn't be complaining about the amount of space. I would, however, be wondering, well, why put 6 systems on one page and 2 on the next when I could do 4 and 4? If I did 4 and 4, it's going to look more even. So I might just go to that 4th system here and put in a page break with Control Enter. Now I have 4 systems and 4 systems, and it's balanced better, right? So I might do that. It's still the case, actually, that because this one had 4 systems plus a title, it's not. It's actually still not balanced completely. But I might also put in some line breaks. Like if I put in a system break in the middle of this system right here, now there's, what did I do? Oh, if I put in enough breaks so that there's 5 systems, now it's starting to look pretty well balanced. Maybe I would say, hey, that's actually, let me put in 5 systems on the other page too. So I'm going to add line breaks, system breaks to balance things. MuseScore is not going to do that for you. It's not going to say, hey, what's the best way to balance the number of pages? It's going to do what's called a greedy algorithm, where it fills the first page as tight as much as it can, then moves on to the next page, fills it as much as it can, moves on to the next page, fills it as much as it can, and then whatever's left over goes on to the last page. But if you don't have enough left over on the last page, MuseScore isn't going to do anything about it except stretch it out. I'm telling you, that's your job. Your job is going to be to do exactly what I'm doing here, to go through your score and add breaks. Like right now, right, this, I didn't do a good job of this because we can see some systems are way more crowded than other systems. I was just sort of demonstrating. But I could have made that choice. So I could get rid of this and just maybe put in a break here and a break here and get rid of these breaks. I'm just trying to put in breaks in places that are a little more balanced so that every system also has approximately the same number of measures. See, this look that I have now is much better balanced, right? It's every system, and I didn't count, I didn't do anything, and because this is a silly example, there's nothing but whole notes. So normally it's not about counting measures, it's about looking for logical places and kind of eyeballing when it looks crowded. But just looking at it, you can see that the pages look approximately the same in terms of how full they are, and each system looks approximately the same in terms of how full they are also. Yeah, maybe I'm going to move this one over. I'm going to put it here and not there. Now these 2 systems are much closer to the same. And maybe the same here, like this is like not quite enough measures, so I want it here and not there. And now it's really well balanced. I could still look at the last system and say, oh, it's a little sparse there. But this idea of balancing like where your line breaks should go so that each system looks relatively the same fullness and each page is relatively the same fullness, and you end up with the last page, filling down to the bottom and it looking like your other pages. That's the art in music. There's a lot of art to music engraving, but that's a big part of it. And it's actually called casting off, deciding where your break should go. And it's not just a visual thing. It's also about deciding, like, you don't want to have a page break in the middle of a repeated section because then people are going to have to keep flipping the page back and forth, perhaps. You don't want to have a system break in the middle of like a really complicated 16th note passage because then that's like the eye has to move back and forth in the middle of something. You want to be able to scan ahead. So there's a musical aspect to deciding where your breaks should go, but then there's also a sort of an aesthetic, a visual aspect to it. So Bob's question here about splitting measures to move pickups to the start of a new system is that's a good question. Your distinction is exactly accurate, although it's not so much Bach versus modern, it's chorales versus everything else. So if you're dealing with something that's basically a chorale or a hymn, where it's people singing all the same rhythm, and it's a series of lines, blah 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 blah, and you would write out the lyrics with a comma at the end of every line. It makes sense to put the line breaks at the end of every line. So like, okay, this I'm just trying to think of something, and this like, oh, say, can you see? By the dawn, that by the is the down is the pickup to the next line. And maybe you want that to start the next system. That idea that, one line of lyric should correspond to one line of music, that's really big in the hymn world, the chorale world. And so, yeah, you do often end up splitting a measure. So if anyone hasn't seen how to do that, I'll show you exactly how to do it. Let me zoom in here. Let's say that I have some quarter notes here, and let's enter some lyrics. I need to change this also to a dotted half. Yeah, actually, this is really only going to work in places where everyone has more or less the same rhythm, so I'll give quarter notes there. And let's say that the lyrics are the last word. Now it is another line. So this idea that we might want, so blah, 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 the last word, period. Then the word now starts the next line. Well, yeah, then in that sort of style of writing hymns, it is pretty traditional to break it up there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the first note of what I want to be the next line, and then go to Tools, Measures, Split Measure before selected note or rest. And when I do that, it basically splits the measure right there. And now I can put the so yeah, I've got 3 beats here, 1 beat there. And then I can select that measure and add my break there. So I have 3 beats here and 1 beat there. Now there's a few things you're going to want to do on top of that. You're going to want to make this bar line either invisible or dashed. I'll go with invisible. So I'm going to select that bar line by clicking it and press V. And you actually have to do that for each staff. So I've now made that bar line invisible. It's grayed out on screen, but it's basically it's invisible for real. If I go to the Properties panel here and turn off the display of, oops, I want to make sure nothing is selected. I'm pressing Escape a bunch of times. I want to turn off the display of invisible items, and now you can see it is gone. So that's one thing you'd want to do. The other thing you want to do is make sure that this little partial measure doesn't get numbered. We don't want it, if this was measure 48, we don't want that one extra beat to be measure 49. So I'm going to come here, right-click the measure, go to Measure Properties, and check the Exclude from Measure Count option. So that's kind of the series of things you would do. So that's how you do it. And the question of when is if you're doing something that's basically similar to a Bach chorale, if you're writing an actual hymn that has that same kind of structure, then by all means do it. It's fine. It's good. Any other situation, it's it's not. Yeah, it would be frowned upon in any other situation. If there's not a good lyric related reason to make the switch, or if that measure is just so full of 30-second notes, say, that it would have wrapped around to the next line and left the previous line kind of too sparse. Sometimes you'll see, like in Chopin, stuff like that, those long cadenza-like passages. Sometimes you'll see him split those measures just for practical reasons because it was going to be awkward. I remember going through an example with Beethoven Pathetique. The introduction there had a passage that's just like it's possible to notate it in a way where you have this long measure on one system, but you end up getting better looking results if you split that measure. And so there's a few cases where it might be okay. So, so that was talking about how to like fill this last page. It's not going to be very often that you need to figure out how to squeeze more onto a page, because MuseScore is already going to be squeezing an awful lot onto a page. But let me go ahead and just create a lead sheet. And I'm going to go to the Jazz lead sheet template and add a whole bunch of measures until it spills to the next page. Actually, there we go. And on this window, shrink it down a little bit. There we go. So it spilled onto the next page, and it fit quite a few measures onto this system. And it wouldn't be able to do that once chord symbols were in there. If you really needed to squeeze this, you needed to squeeze one more system. Like, let me delete some more measures here so that there's only one system on the next page. And I'm like, can I get it to fit? Well, the same principles are going to apply. You know, when I showed you about reducing stretch to force more measures to fit, MuseScore doesn't have a vertical stretch concept like that, but it's just going to let you go to Format, Style, Page, and you can reduce this guy, the minimum system distance. That's how it's going to decide what can fit. So if I reduce this enough, it might, there we go. It just was able to fit it. Now, it's fitting it, but that's because there's no notes here, no chord symbols here. Chances are I wouldn't be able to fit it otherwise. So instead of doing that, that's going to make it really crowded. If you keep everything full size and then you force it to fit by reducing distances, you're going to have no white space left on your page. It's going to be crowded and hard to read. I generally recommend instead going to Format, Page Settings. And actually, let me do one thing here. I'm going to show you another little trick I almost never use. I want to put in system breaks on every system here to force it to stay the same number of systems as I make more changes. So I'm going to select all, go to Format, Add Remove System Breaks, and then say Add a System Break at end of each system. That option there is going to go ahead and add system breaks everywhere. There's everywhere it already was the end of a line. So now if I go to Format, Page Settings, and reduce the overall staff size, it's going to keep the line breaks where they were. And I want to see how much I have to reduce it to get one more system onto there. And I do see your question, Marla. I'll come back to that before I wrap up. Let's see if going from 1.75 to 1.7 does the job. Not quite. How about if I go down to 1.6? Yep, that did the job. Would 1.65 have done it? Nope, not quite. 1.61? Yeah, all right. So how about 1.63? So 1.63. 1.64? Nope. 1.63. So I went down from 1.75 to 1.63. Someone could do the math on it, but when I said like an adjustment of like 5 to 10%, that was less than that. So a relatively small change to the size of the staff will often allow more to fit, and it does it in a way that doesn't get too crowded. I didn't have to reduce the minimum system distance to do it. I just made things a little bit smaller. So we're going to still have as much white space as we did before, which is very useful for reading. So anyhow, these are some of the settings you want to play with. So before I go, I'm going to look at Marla's question. Can you add a title and copyrights? Uh, what happens to system spacing? Well, so if you add, say, a frame, if I come here and go plus frames, insert vertical frame, it'll add a frame here, and then it just pushes things to the next page. A frame is essentially a system as far as MuseScore is concerned. So it's going to decide if that frame fits on this page and push everything over. I have a feeling whatever you're asking about is going to be too much for me to get into here, but feel free to write it up and post it to the discussion space and maybe with an example, and I can talk about it at more detail. And also as far as the footer, right now there's basically no information in that footer, but if I go to Format, Style, let me move this dialog over a little bit, header, footer, and then I put in some information here. Let's say I don't want different and odd pages, and I start putting in some text here, blah, 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 and let me put it in the left so we can see it. If I add enough text, notice what just happened. There were 3 systems here. Here's my footer text. As I add another line of text, now there's only 2 systems. So it does allocate enough space for that. MuseScore 3 wasn't as good about that. MuseScore 4 is much more sophisticated about that sort of thing. All right. So this was like a lot of talking about spacing and so forth because there's a lot of different stuff to deal with here. The point, there's a lot of points to make here, but the point I want to make right now is that this is actually covered in my course. There's a whole section on page layout or formatting, and that section has a whole series of lessons on horizontal spacing and vertical spacing and frames and breaks and how to get more measures onto a system, how to get fewer measures onto a system, kind of laying it all out. And I want to kind of summarize and wrap them all together here. But if you need more information on any of those topics, go to my course. Go to the MuseScore 4 course. That whole section on page layout is it's got like every bit of information you would want about this, showing demonstrations with less rambling, less, it's me much more focused going through that. And in that same approximately hour of time, you will learn a ton about how to do things. So I don't know if the music is going to sound like anything when I do this now, but I'm going to play it anyhow and see what we hear. Yeah, it sounds like junk. So I'm going to turn that off. And thanks everyone for being here. And yeah, there's a lot to talk about with formatting, and I talk about it every couple of years or so. Oh, it's playing through the speaker. That's curious. But anyhow, I will be here for the music masterclass tomorrow. I will have figured out my sound issues long before then and have that working. And look forward to talking to everyone tomorrow if you can make it, and if not, I'll be back here for the cafe. We'll be looking at our score of the month because it'll be the 3rd week, and we'll be looking at the choral piece. So anyone who wants to be working on the notation project, I posted it into the community yesterday or Monday, so it's a choral piece. I would love to have people work on that piece, post your results, and we can talk about how you did in next week's MuseScore Cafe. All right, see you later, everyone.